Back in the 1970s, while everyone was watching Bobby Orr fly around the ice, another player was quietly changing hockey forever. Phil Esposito looked slow, wasn't a great skater, and didn't have fancy moves. But here's the thing. He scored more goals than anyone had ever seen before. We're talking about a guy who became the first NHL player to score 100 points in a season and first to take over 500 shots in 1 year. Picture this, a kid from Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, who wasn't the fastest or most skilled, somehow scored 76 goals in a single season, a record that stood for years. But here's the crazy part. While other players were trying to be fancy, Esposito figured out something so simple that it changed hockey forever. Just stand in front of the net and wait for the puck. This isn't just another hockey story. This is about how a regular guy who worked at his dad's welding shop became one of the greatest goal scorers in NHL history. And the best part, he did it all without a single fancy move. He just outsmarted everyone else on the ice. And folks, if you're loving these untold stories of hockey legends, smash that like button and subscribe. We're pushing hard for 5,000 subscribers, and with your help, we can unlock even more incredible NHL stories. In today's NHL, every player knows that the front of the net is prime real estate. But back in the 1960s, nobody thought about camping there. That all changed because of Phil Esposito. If he hadn't discovered this simple trick, today's game would look completely different. Before Esposito came along, centers were expected to be playmakers, not goal scorers. They would skate around, pass the puck, and maybe take a shot from far away. But Phil looked at the game differently. He realized something that seems so obvious now. Most goals come from close to the net, often on rebounds or deflections. The stakes were huge. In 1968 to 69, when he first truly mastered this style, he shattered the NHL record with 126 points in a single season. The previous record was just 97 points. This wasn't just breaking a record, it was completely changing what people thought was possible in hockey. Think about what was at risk. If Esposito had failed, he would have been laughed out of the league. Other players and coaches called his style garbage collecting and said it wasn't real hockey. But he kept at it because he knew something they didn't. The scoreboard doesn't care how pretty the goals look. If Phil Esposito hadn't stuck to his guns and proven this strategy worked, we might never have seen players like Wayne Gretzky break his records using the same techniques. The entire way hockey is played today, from youth leagues to the NHL, comes from one guy who dared to think differently. Phil Esposito's story starts like so many Canadian hockey tales, in a small blue-collar town where kids learned to skate almost before they could walk. But here's what makes this story different. While most hockey legends were childhood prodigies, young Phil was anything but. Growing up in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, he spent as much time in his father's welding shop as he did on the ice, and nobody, absolutely nobody, was predicting NHL greatness. Picture a teenage Phil in the late 1950s, skating at the local rink. While other kids were zooming around showing off their speed, he was that kid who always seemed a step behind. His skating style? Let's just say it wasn't going to win any beauty contests. He looked more like he was trudging through snow than gliding on ice. But something fascinating was happening that nobody noticed at first. While everyone else was trying to be the fastest skater or make the prettiest moves, Phil was watching, thinking, and figuring out a different way to play the game. Here's where it gets interesting. Playing junior hockey for the Sault Ste. Marie Greyhounds, Phil started developing what would later become his signature style. While his coaches were pulling their hair out trying to make him faster, he was quietly learning something crucial. You don't need to be the fastest guy on the ice if you're always in the right spot. He might not have been able to chase down the puck like other players, but he had this uncanny ability to know where it was going to end up. During his early days with the Chicago Blackhawks minor league team, the St. Catharines Teepees, Phil started perfecting what would later revolutionize hockey. Instead of trying to compete with the speedsters, he developed an almost supernatural sense of positioning. He'd plant himself in front of the net, using his sturdy 6 feet 1 inch frame not to push people around, but to create space. Other players would zip around him like bees around a flower, but Phil, he just stood there, waiting for his moment. The hockey world back then didn't quite know what to make of him. Here was this kid who looked like he was playing in slow motion, but somehow the puck kept finding its way into the net when he was on the ice. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't flashy, but boy, was it effective. Now, let me tell you about the years when Phil Esposito didn't just change hockey, he completely rewrote the record books. And he did it alongside a guy named Bobby Orr in what might be the greatest 1-2 punch hockey has ever seen. The 1968 to 69 season, that's when everything clicked. While Bobby Orr was doing his magic from the blue line, Phil parked himself in front of the net and put up numbers that made people think the scorekeepers had lost their minds. 126 points in a single season, at a time when 100 points seemed about as likely as seeing a penguin fly. The crazy part? He was just getting started. But here's the thing about Phil and Bobby. They weren't just teammates. They were like a perfectly engineered hockey machine. While Bobby would dance through the entire opposing team, Phil would be there, right in front of the net, turning Orr's genius into goals. The numbers during their time together in Boston are just ridiculous. Phil put up 152 points in 1970-71, then topped it with 76 goals and 154 points in 1970-72. Remember, this was in an era when most players thought 50 points was a good season. Speaking of 1970-72, those years gave us two of the sweetest moments in Boston sports history. Back-to-back Stanley Cup victories, with Phil and Bobby leading the charge. The 1970 Cup final against St. Louis, Phil put up 13 points in just 4 games. That's not just scoring, that's absolutely demolishing the opposition. But let's talk about the records for a minute. First player to hit 100 points, that was Phil. First to take 500 shots in a season, Phil again. Most goals in a season at that time, you guessed it. Phil's 76 and 71-72 set a mark that even the great Gordie Howe couldn't touch. Between 1968 and 1975, he led the league in points 5 times, and nobody could figure out how to stop him. You know what's really wild? In his peak years with Boston, Phil averaged more than 60 goals per season. Modern players can barely hit that mark with today's advanced training and equipment. Phil did it with a wooden stick and heavy skates. And while everyone remembers the goals, here's a stat that'll blow your mind. He also led the league in assists in 1974, proving he wasn't just a one-trick pony. Let me craft the emotional elements of Phil Esposito's story, focusing on these compelling personal angles. Being Bobby Orr's teammate was like standing next to a supernova. No matter how bright you shined, most people only saw his light. Here was Phil Esposito, shattering scoring records left and right, but walk down any street in Boston, and all you'd hear was, "Bobby, Bobby, Bobby." But you know what made Phil special? He never let it bother him. Instead of fighting for the spotlight, he figured out how to work with it. While everyone was watching Orr's end-to-end rushes, Phil was quietly putting up numbers that seemed impossible. Talk about a chip on your shoulder, the critics just wouldn't let up. Garbage collector, they called him. Lucky, they said. Every goal he scored seemed to come with an asterisk in some people's minds. But Phil had this amazing way of turning criticism into fuel. Each garbage goal just proved his point. The puck doesn't care how it gets into the net, and neither did the scoreboard. Now imagine being Phil Esposito, leading the league in scoring, while your younger brother Tony is stopping pucks for the Chicago Blackhawks. The Esposito brothers weren't just writing their own chapters in hockey history. They were often facing each other in some of the biggest games of their careers. Tony would go on to become one of the greatest goaltenders in NHL history. And there's nothing quite like trying to score on your little brother when the Stanley Cup is on the line. And then there were the big bad Bruins. Phil wasn't just part of the team, he was its beating heart. While Derek Sanderson and Wayne Cashman were throwing bodies around, and Bobby Orr was redefining defense, Phil was the steady presence that turned all that chaos into victories. These weren't just teammates. They were a band of brothers who played hard, lived harder, and changed hockey forever. They fought together, celebrated together, and created a style of hockey that Boston fans still talk about today. In the middle of all this was Phil, not the fastest, not the prettiest skater, but the guy who showed up every night and found a way to get the job done. He didn't need to be the poster boy or the fan favorite. He just needed to be Phil Esposito, the guy who could look at a game everyone thought they understood and see something completely different. Next time you watch an NHL game, pay attention to where the goals are scored. That crowded area right in front of the net, that's Phil Esposito's legacy in action. What started as one player's simple trick has become fundamental hockey strategy, from Pee Wee leagues to the Stanley Cup finals. The numbers tell the story. 717 career goals, 873 assists, 1,590 points, and multiple 100-point seasons in an era when that seemed impossible. He held 28 NHL records at one point, but numbers only tell part of the story. Esposito didn't just score goals, he changed how everyone thought about scoring them. Today's players might not know it, but every time they battle for position in front of the net, they're following Phil's playbook. He proved that sometimes the simplest solution is the best one. And in doing so, he didn't just change hockey strategy, he revolutionized the entire sport. And folks, If you found this video helpful, you know what to do. Smash that subscribe button and drop a like. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know to make more content like this. Catch you in the next one.